before smartphones, before GPS, before every moment of our lives was quietly backed up to a server somewhere. There was a time when a child could disappear and leave behind almost nothing. No final text, no location ping, no video clip to rewind and analyze, just absence. And in rare cases, an absence so complete, it's as if the child never existed at all. Tonight's story is not about a single crime scene. There is no dramatic 911 call to replay, no clear suspect waiting in the shadows. This story is about something slower, quieter, more unsettling. It's about a town, and the children it chose not to remember. In the early 2000s, this town looked like 100 others scattered across the United States. Population just under 10,000. One main road cutting through the center. Local diners where the waitresses knew your name. High school football on Friday nights. Church on Sundays. It was the kind of place people described as safe without thinking too hard about what that word meant. Parents didn't worry when their kids walked home from school. They didn't double-check doors during the day. They trusted the system. They trusted the schools. They trusted the police. They trusted that if something went wrong, someone official would step in and fix it. That trust is important to remember, because it explains how everything that followed was able to happen. The year matters. This was the early 2000s, a strange, forgotten gap between analog life and the digital age. The internet existed, but it was slow and fragmented. Social media hadn't arrived yet. Surveillance cameras were rare and low quality. Most records were still on paper. School attendance was written by hand. Counselor notes went into manila folders. Police reports lived in filing cabinets, not searchable databases. If a document went missing, it didn't trigger an alert. It just vanished. And that made this town, like many others at the time, dangerously easy to manipulate. There was one elementary school, one middle school, one high school. That was it. Everyone passed through the same buildings, had the same teachers, sat in the same classrooms. School wasn't just education, it was record-keeping. Proof that you existed. Your name on a roster. Your photo in a yearbook. Your grades in a filing cabinet. And that's why what happened next is so disturbing. Because years later, when someone finally went looking, those records didn't always line up. Some names appeared once, then never again. Some students seemed to skip entire years. Others existed only in memories, not on paper. The children at the center of this story were not outcasts. They weren't known troublemakers. They weren't on anyone's radar. They were ordinary. Kids born in the early 1990s. Old enough to remember cassette tapes. Young enough to be curious about the internet. They rode bikes. They shared headphones. They complained about homework. They had routines. And routines are important, because routines are predictable. And predictable things don't just disappear on their own. The first disappearance didn't cause panic. It barely caused concern. It was a weekday afternoon. School let out like it always did. Buses pulled away. Kids spilled onto sidewalks. One child didn't make it home on time. That happens, right? A friend's house. A longer walk. Lost track of time. Hours passed. Night came. Phones rang. Neighbors were asked. Lights were left on. By the time the police were called, something had shifted. Fear had entered the room. The response was calm, professional, reassuring. The family was told to wait. 24 hours. Those words matter. Because when someone tells you to wait, they're telling you not to act, not to push, not to make noise. Not yet. By the time the search officially began, whatever trail existed was already cold. And no one could say for sure whether that delay changed the outcome. But it certainly didn't help. Months went by. The first child was still missing. Then another disappeared. Different day, different location, different family. Same result. This time people noticed. Quiet conversations started in kitchens and parking lots. Parents walked their kids a little farther. Doors locked a little earlier. But publicly, Officials were clear. There is no connection. They used words like isolated, and unrelated, and coincidental. And because people wanted to believe them, they did. There's something comforting about being told everything is fine. It allows life to continue. School stayed open. Events weren't canceled. The town moved forward. That's how silence grows. Not suddenly, but gradually. By the time a third disappearance occurred, the pattern was obvious to parents. But patterns only matter when someone in power agrees to see them. And in this town, no one did. When searches finally happened, they looked serious. Volunteers, dogs, flashlights, prayer vigils. But there was a problem. They were unfocused. No central theory. No shared urgency. No sense that time mattered. Media coverage was brief. One segment, a few paragraphs. Then something else took over the news cycle. And just like that, the story slipped out of public view. Years later, someone would notice something strange. But at the time, it went unseen. A school attendance log, a counselor's note, a disciplinary record, small inconsistencies, a missing signature, a date that didn't match, a file that couldn't be found, each one explainable on its own. Together, they suggested something far worse. This is not just a story about missing children. It's a story about systems, about memory, about who controls the narrative. Because long before anyone asked where the children went, someone decided how the town would remember them, or whether it would remember them at all. If you were to stand in this town today, you wouldn't see anything unusual. No memorials, no plaques, no signs of loss, just normal life. And that might be the most disturbing part of all, because in part 2, we'll meet the children themselves and see exactly what was erased when the town moved on. When people talk about missing children, they usually talk in numbers. 1 child, 2 children, 3. Statistics feel safer than names. But before there were numbers, there were kids. And before those kids disappeared, they lived very ordinary lives in this town. Lives that left impressions on people, even if the paperwork no longer proves it. In the early 2000s, classrooms still felt personal. Teachers took attendance out loud. Students answered when their names were called. Substitutes struggled to pronounce last names they'd never heard before. Names mattered. They were spoken every day, which is why the absence of those names later felt wrong. Some students remembered desks that stayed empty for weeks, then months. At first, teachers said those students had transferred, moved away, changed schools, but no one could remember where they went, and no official announcement was ever made. Evan wasn't loud. He wasn't disruptive. He didn't draw attention to himself. He sat near the window in class, finished his work early, spent free periods in the library. Librarians remembered him because he always checked out more books than he was allowed. When he disappeared, the library card stayed active. No cancellation, no closure, just a name that stopped coming through the door. Marissa was impossible to miss. She laughed loudly, passed notes, had opinions about everything. Teachers wrote her name in the margins of notebooks constantly. Talks too much. Disruptive. Bright but unfocused. Her disappearance left a noise behind. Friends noticed immediately, but when they asked questions, they were told to focus on their work. And slowly, even the loud ones learned when to stop talking. Caleb followed rules, walked the same route home, left school at the same time every day, went to the same after-school program. Routines are supposed to keep kids safe. When he didn't show up where he was supposed to be, staff assumed paperwork error. By the time anyone realized he was missing, hours were gone. Lily filled notebooks with sketches, classrooms, houses, people. Sometimes she drew the school from memory, windows carefully placed, doors counted and recounted. After she vanished, one of her notebooks turned up in a lost and found bin. No one could explain how it got there. It was eventually thrown away. Children remember differently than adults. They remember moments, small details, the seat someone used to sit in, the voice that used to answer roll call. Years later, former students would say the same thing. They were there. I know they were. But memory isn't evidence. And without records, memory can be dismissed. Buses mattered in this town. Routes were predictable. Drivers recognized kids, which is why it was strange that no bus driver ever reported anything unusual. No disturbances, no empty seats that raised alarms. It suggested something uncomfortable. Whatever happened, didn't happen on the bus. This was the most dangerous time of day. Too late for school supervision. Too early for parents to be home. Kids walked together, split off at corners, took shortcuts. There were blind spots, alleyways, tree-lined paths, unmonitored buildings, places that felt safe because nothing bad had ever happened there before. Until it did. This was the era of early chat rooms. Parents worried about strangers online. Authorities leaned heavily into this explanation. But there was a problem. No accounts, no chat logs, no digital trail. The theory stayed anyway, because it shifted blame away from the town itself. The most disturbing moment didn't happen in public. It happened quietly. Parent requested school records, attendance, counselor notes, transfer paperwork. What they received was thin, pages missing, dates that didn't align, signatures that didn't match. When they asked questions, they were told the files were old. Things get lost. But lost is not the same as erased. Kids notice adult fear. They see it in body language, hear it in tone. Questions were met with discomfort, concern with irritation. Eventually, students stopped asking, and silence became normal. If they're alive today, they would be adults. They would have jobs, histories, social security numbers. And yet, there are no clear traces, no confirmed sightings, no documentation. It's as if their lives paused and never resumed. The most frightening part of this story isn't what happened to the children, it's how easily the world kept going. Without them, it began quietly. An ordinary Thursday in early spring. Evan walked home from school like he did every day. The sky was gray, the sidewalks still damp from overnight rain. No one thought to watch. At home, dinner was set. Parents expected him any minute. When the sun went down, he still hadn't returned. By the time the phone rang, worry had taken root. The police were called. The official response? Calm, measured, reassuring. We'll wait 24 hours. That's protocol. 24 hours. Enough time for evidence to vanish. Enough time for memories to fade. Enough time for silence to begin. When officers arrived, they went door to door. Neighbors said nothing unusual. Friends didn't notice anything. It was as if Evan had evaporated. No witnesses, no leads, no traces. By nightfall, the search expanded. A flashlight here, a dog sniffing there. The town was looking, but not seeing. Because the missing often leave more than absence, they leave voids. And voids are easy to overlook. Months passed. Life tried to continue as normal. Then Marissa vanished. Same town, different neighborhood. No warning, no evidence. The school held a brief assembly. Teachers told students to focus on work. The principal reassured the community. There is no connection, no need to panic. The word coincidence was used often. Repetition made it believable. Parents whispered privately, but publicly, they followed instructions. Life moved forward. It was obvious to families. 3 children missing in under a year. All ordinary, all routine, all gone. But the authorities refused to call it a pattern. And in small towns, the word of authority carries weight. Pattern implies design, intent, something darker than simple accident. And that is what no one wanted to admit. Searches were organized. Volunteers joined at first light. Dogs combed the parks. Parents walked block by block. Missing posters went up. Local radio broadcast a few lines. A reporter from the regional newspaper visited. took notes, and left. It was enough to appear serious, not enough to be effective. By evening, the search teams were tired. The posters were weathered. Hope was fading, and the town returned to its routines. When a third disappearance occurred, Caleb, officials leaned on a narrative that would define the entire case. Runaways, troubled families, internet dangers. Despite no evidence of any of these, the story became accepted. Parents were told not to question it. Teachers were reminded to avoid discussion in class. Silence was not only encouraged, it became policy. The failure wasn't sudden. It was slow, cumulative, invisible. Paper records that went missing. Attendance sheets destroyed by accident. Witness statements dismissed as unreliable. Every small oversight added up, until it became a wall that hid the truth behind routine, process, and bureaucracy. The pattern in timing is critical. All disappearances occurred after school, before parents returned, in locations minimally supervised. Sidewalks lined with houses, but no one saw. Bus routes followed, but no driver recalled anything unusual. Neighborhoods quiet, familiar, safe. And yet, safety had a blind spot: human attention. The early 2000s meant no smartphones, no GPS trackers, no home security cameras, limited cell phone coverage. Parents relied on observation and trust. The authorities relied on paper records, and the children relied on both. When both failed, there was no backup. Some families spoke up. Some tried to organize. Some moved away quietly. But the majority chose what was easier: denial. The town reinforced its routines. School events continued. Football games on Friday night. Church on Sunday. Life moved forward. And the children became gaps in memory. This is the darkest part. The town learned not to look too closely. Teachers didn't ask. Students didn't ask. Parents who protested were subtly silenced. Fear became a quiet force. Not the fear of danger, but the fear of acknowledging what had already happened. Years later, investigators would point to the first missing child and see that the official response had been inadequate. 24 hours. Missed evidence. A community primed to believe reassurance over truth. The seeds of erasure were sown then. The children were still gone, and no one officially remembered their absence in a way that mattered. By the end of this segment, 3 children have disappeared. The town has chosen silence. The system has failed. The narrative has been written, but the truth lies underneath. By the time the 3rd child vanished, the town could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. Volunteers gathered. Neighborhoods were combed block by block. Flashlights pierced the shadows. Dogs sniffed every corner, alley, and overgrown lot. At first, there was energy, determination, hope. Banners were printed. Missing posters hung on telephone poles. Churches held vigils. But beneath the surface, the searches were flawed. Routes were incomplete. Leads were ignored. Patterns went unexamined. It was as if the town wanted to look busy, but not too closely. A reporter from a regional news station visited once. Camera crew, lights, microphone, everything seemed official. But the segment was short. The footage barely aired. The headline read something safe: 3 children missing. Authorities investigating. No follow-up. No deep dive. No public pressure to act. And just like that, the town's collective focus began to fade. Parents tried to do what the authorities couldn't or wouldn't. They conducted their own searches, contacted friends and distant relatives, followed up with leads on their own. But without official cooperation, their efforts were slow, painstaking, and often futile. Some were warned to stop asking questions. Some were subtly threatened. Some were told that they were overreacting. The message was clear. The town had decided that this was not its problem. By now, a story had emerged. Runaways, troubled families, internet predators. Authorities leaned on what sounded plausible. Despite no evidence, despite no proof, the public accepted it. Parents questioned themselves. Children noticed that their questions weren't welcome. And the town moved forward, as if what was missing no longer mattered. Each small failure seemed trivial, but together they formed a wall of official ignorance. No one could point to a single act of malice, but the effect was the same. The children were being erased. Each day without new leads strengthened the narrative of coincidence and misfortune. Neighbors stopped noticing. Students adjusted. Teachers stopped asking. Even volunteers who had combed the woods came to accept. There's nothing left to find. And that acceptance would prove more damaging than any single act of neglect. Silence spread like a virus. Children learned not to ask questions. Parents learned not to speak publicly. Teachers learned not to respond. This was not fear of criminals. This was fear of acknowledging what had already happened. The town's collective memory began to fade. The disappearances became a story you didn't tell. A story you pretended didn't exist. Some files were misplaced. Others were accidentally destroyed. Requests for information were delayed, denied, or deflected. Even the most diligent investigator began to feel resistance, not from criminals, but from the town itself. Patterns that were obvious privately never made it into the official record. Evidence that could have connected cases disappeared quietly. The cover-up was subtle, but it was real. A code had formed in the town. Don't talk about missing children. Don't ask questions. Don't remember. These were not laws written on paper. They were enforced through discomfort, gossip, and social pressure. Anyone who broke them faced judgment, isolation, a quiet warning from neighbors. And over time, this unspoken code became stronger than any law. The early 2000s were particularly cruel in this respect. Surveillance cameras were rare. Cell phones were primitive. Social media didn't exist. If a child went missing, there was almost no way to trace them digitally. No footage, no ping, no automatic alert. This gap in technology made the town's silence even more dangerous, because even those who wanted to search were handicapped. Other children noticed. Friends stopped asking questions. Siblings adjusted to absence. Schoolmates learned which topics to avoid. The lessons were clear. Some things are off-limits. Some truths are too heavy for young ears. By the end of Part 4, the town itself had become complicit, whether consciously or not. 3 children gone. Searches conducted, yet fruitless. Files missing. Media attention fading. The town enforces silence without saying a word. When children disappear, families are supposed to be the first line of defense. In this town, that line failed to hold. Parents searched tirelessly, yet were met with barriers. Calls to police went unanswered or deferred. Requests for records were delayed or ignored. Concerned teachers were warned not to discuss it in front of students. One mother described it as, "I was screaming into a void, and the void smiled back." The town, consciously or unconsciously, had created an environment in which silence was easier than confrontation. Every day became a calculation. Walk home routines altered. After-school activities canceled. Friends avoided certain topics. Siblings of missing children carried the weight silently. Parents forced their grief inward, aware that speaking out could isolate them further. The town was not overtly hostile. It was quietly complicit. The children became gaps in everyday life, not tragedies. The most concrete erasure happened in the schools. Attendance records vanished. Yearbook photos were mysteriously absent. Class rosters were altered. Former teachers who tried to question these changes were silenced with reassurances. Things get misplaced. Don't worry. But lost is not the same as erased. The erasure was deliberate enough to rewrite history. Future students would never know these children had existed. The town's memory had been edited, page by page, name by name. Parents who tried to preserve memory were ignored. Efforts to commemorate birthdays or school milestones met with indifference or resistance. Even when I showed up at the school with cake, one parent recalled, they told me it was inappropriate to mention him. Every small act of remembrance was a challenge to the town's unspoken rule. Forget. This silent erasure affected everyone. Children internalized guilt. Parents doubted themselves. Families grew apart under strain. The social fabric of the town began to fray. Grief became private. Sorrow was hidden behind polite smiles and normal routines. The disappearances were no longer just crimes. They became invisible scars etched into the community. Some former classmates refused to forget. They spoke about missing friends at reunions, kept notes, shared memories online. But memories alone cannot prove existence. And in a town determined to forget, memory is a fragile weapon. "We knew they were here," one childhood friend said years later. "But nobody else would believe us." The town's choice to ignore the disappearances was not necessarily evil. It was fear disguised as normalcy. Fear that attention might reveal incompetence, negligence, or complicity. By choosing silence, the town protected its image, but at the cost of truth, at the cost of the children, at the cost of its own humanity. Even decades later, questions remain. Why did certain records vanish? Who decided these children could be forgotten? Were there individuals consciously hiding evidence? These questions are difficult because the system was trained to make you stop asking them. And the hardest question of all: how many others were forgotten before anyone noticed? One father remembers seeing the empty seat at school every day. One mother keeps a notebook of dates that should exist but don't. One sibling confesses that they still hear the laughter of the missing in quiet moments. And it's a sound that nobody else can recognize. These stories are raw. They are human. They remind us that statistics and protocols cannot capture grief. By the end of this period in the timeline, something begins to happen. Digitalization of records. Journalists asking new questions. Parents refusing to let go. Slowly, a thread appears. Gaps in attendance logs. Discrepancies in yearbooks. Files that never existed. For the first time, the erasure itself becomes visible. 3 children have vanished. Families suffer in silence. The town has rewritten history to make their absence invisible. But cracks are appearing. Took more than a decade. Paper files finally scanned. Attendance logs uploaded. Counselor notes digitized. What should have been routine now revealed something terrifying. Gaps, blanks. Children whose existence could no longer be verified. The first researcher to notice it assumed a clerical error. But when the second and third researcher checked, the gaps remained. The records did not lie. The children had been erased. Journalists and private investigators came. Families cooperated. Former teachers were interviewed. Patterns emerged. Missing students concentrated in certain neighborhoods. Records inconsistently maintained. Notices of absence altered or destroyed. It was obvious. The erasure was not accidental. It was deliberate. And it had worked for years. Why did the town choose forgetting? Fear of blame. Officials feared scandal, lawsuits, or loss of reputation. Desire for normalcy. Daily routines were more important than inconvenient truths. Social pressure. Speaking out threatened relationships, jobs, and social standing. Someone somewhere decided it was easier to let the children vanish from memory than to confront the uncomfortable truth. It's one thing for a child to disappear. It's another for the community to act as if it never happened. Parents second-guess every decision. Teachers carry guilt quietly. Friends grow up carrying invisible weight. Even decades later, survivors report the same feeling. A hollow space in society where the missing should have been. The silence is louder than words. The absence is heavier than loss. Some parents still fight. Maintaining blogs, social media pages, and archives. Attending town meetings demanding answers. Speaking to the press, even when told to remain silent. They insist the children existed. They insist they must be remembered. And in doing so, they defy the town's long-standing rule. Forget. Names once erased are now spoken aloud. In interviews, in investigative reports, in public records restored. Each name is a small act of resistance against deliberate forgetting. Evan, Marissa, Caleb, Lily. Once invisible, now impossible to ignore. Investigators pieced together timelines. Disappearances correlated with gaps in attendance logs. Missing children shared certain neighborhoods and schools. Authorities' records show repeated mismanagement, possibly deliberate. Though nobody will claim full responsibility, the evidence paints a chilling picture. A town capable of erasing its own children from history. This story is not just about these children. It's about human memory, accountability, and complicity. It asks, how do communities choose who is remembered? How do systems fail quietly, leaving traces only decades later? How much silence is too much? The answer is not comforting. Because silence, when practiced deliberately, can be more powerful and more destructive than any single criminal act. We close by speaking the names once again. Evan, Marissa, Caleb, Lily. Each one was here. Each one mattered. Each one was almost forgotten. And yet, here they remain. In memory, in records, in truth. Forgetting is a choice. Remembering is resistance. And the truth, however delayed, always finds a way to return. As the screen fades to black, let us consider how many gaps exist in the communities we call safe. How often do we look the other way? And how many children, quietly erased, are waiting for someone to remember them? The town tried to forget, but we do not have to. And so, the story remains a warning. Silence can protect no one, least of all the most vulnerable.